Somewhere between the baby boomers and the millennials, there's a generation that doesn't get much airtime. No think pieces about their avocado toast, no documentaries about their identity crises. Gen X just quietly went ahead and built some of the most stable marriages in modern history, and almost nobody is talking about why. Here's what the data actually shows. Divorce rates in the United States peaked in the 1980s and have been declining since. But the generation driving that decline isn't who you'd expect. Gen Xers, people born roughly between 1965 and 1980, are staying married at higher rates than boomers did at the same age. They're outlasting the generation that invented the self-help industry and the generation currently Googling attachment styles on their third date. So what is going on? Let's start with something that sounds like an insult but is actually a superpower. Gen X was largely raised by distracted parents. Boomers were busy reinventing the world, working longer hours, going through divorces of their own, discovering personal fulfillment. Latchkey kids came home to empty houses. They made their own snacks, solved their own problems, entertained themselves without structured activities or parental helicopter supervision. They became radically self-sufficient before they even hit high school. And here's why that matters for marriage. Self-reliance doesn't make you a bad partner. It makes you a less desperate one. Psychologists have found that people who enter relationships from a place of independence, rather than emotional need, form more secure attachments. They're not looking for a spouse to complete them. They're looking for someone to stand alongside them. That's a fundamentally different foundation, and it holds up a lot longer under pressure. Gen X also came of age during a very specific cultural moment. They watched their boomer parents divorce in record numbers. They saw the fallout up close, the custody arrangements, the financial chaos, the emotional wreckage. And rather than inheriting the same romantic idealism that fueled those marriages, Gen X developed something more valuable: realistic expectations. This matters enormously. Research from the University of Tennessee found that one of the strongest predictors of marital dissatisfaction isn't conflict. It's the gap between what people expected marriage to be and what it actually is. The wider that gap, the harder the fall. Gen Xers went in with their eyes open. They weren't expecting a fairy tale. They were expecting a person with all the inconvenience and complexity that comes with one. And when reality arrived, they weren't blindsided by it. Now add the communication piece, because this is where it gets really interesting. Gen X is the last generation to have fully navigated relationships without the internet. They fought in person. They made up in person. They sat in uncomfortable silence and had to deal with it. They couldn't send a passive-aggressive text and avoid eye contact for 3 days. They had to actually look at each other and figure it out. That's not a small thing. Conflict resolution is a skill. And like any skill, it requires practice in real conditions. Gen Xers got that practice before there were digital escape hatches, before you could curate your emotional availability, before you could ghost someone you'd been dating for 6 months without a single conversation. They learned to stay in the room. And staying in the room over and over across years and decades is basically what marriage is. There's another factor that doesn't get nearly enough credit: Gen X's relationship with identity. Millennials were told they could be anything. Gen X was told to figure it out. And they did, usually alone, usually through trial and error, usually without validation from the outside world. This created something psychologists call a stable internal locus of control. The belief that your outcomes are largely a result of your own choices and efforts, not circumstance, luck, or what other people think of you. People with a strong internal locus of control handle the long arc of marriage differently. When things get hard, they don't immediately ask whether the relationship is the problem. They ask what they can do differently. That's not passivity, that's agency. And sustained relationships need a lot of it. Social media has also played a surprising role here. Gen X got married, mostly, before Facebook made everyone's highlight reel visible and before Instagram convinced an entire generation that other people's lives looked better than theirs. They weren't constantly comparing their Tuesday night to someone else's vacation photos. They weren't measuring their relationship against a curated performance of happiness. They were just living with all the unglamorous ordinariness that real partnership involves. Researchers at the University of Pittsburgh found a direct correlation between heavy social media use and relationship dissatisfaction. The comparison mechanism is relentless and it's corrosive. Gen X largely escaped it during the formative years of their marriages. They built the relationship before the noise arrived, and by the time it did, they were already anchored. There's also a generational attitude toward commitment itself that deserves attention. Gen X tends to view marriage as a decision you make once and defend, not a feeling you ride until it changes. That's not romanticized self-sacrifice. It's a fundamentally different philosophy about what commitment means. Feelings fluctuate, attraction ebbs, enthusiasm for any long-term endeavor has seasons. Gen Xers were shaped by a culture that understood this without being taught it explicitly. They didn't expect to feel the same way at 45 as they did at 25. They expected to choose anyway. This connects directly to something therapists call distress tolerance, the ability to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to eliminate its source. A generation raised on independence, limited emotional coddling, and real-world problem-solving developed higher distress tolerance almost by default. And high distress tolerance in a partnership means you don't blow up the relationship every time it stops feeling easy. You wait, you work, you remember that the hard season is not the whole story. None of this means Gen X marriages are perfect. They're not. Divorce still happens. Unhappiness exists. The numbers are better, not flawless, but the pattern is real, and it points at something worth understanding. If you strip away the nostalgia and look at the actual mechanisms, what you find is a generation that developed relational durability through circumstance. They weren't handed it. They weren't taught it in seminars. It was forged in empty houses after school, in relationships before the internet gave them infinite other options, in watching the generation before them wreck perfectly good lives on the altar of impossible expectations. They came to marriage a little harder, a little more self-contained, a little less likely to confuse temporary discomfort with permanent incompatibility. And it turns out those are exactly the qualities that keep two people together across the long, ordinary, sometimes difficult, occasionally extraordinary stretch of a shared life. The takeaway here isn't that Gen X did everything right. It's that the conditions that shaped them happen to align remarkably well with what sustaining a long-term partnership actually requires. Independence, realistic expectations, practiced conflict resolution, identity that doesn't depend on a partner's approval, tolerance for the inevitable discomfort of real intimacy. Those aren't generational quirks, they're blueprints, and they work across any generation willing to take them seriously.